Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Independent Outlook. I'm Graham Walker. I'm the Executive Director at the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. We're right across the bay from San Francisco, and we are welcoming everybody from around North America and even beyond through our ThinkSpot partnership to this conversation of some of the events of the day from what we hope will be a refreshing and truly independent outlook. And when we say independent, we mean it's coming from the Independent Institute, but that's because we seek to articulate a way of thinking about the issues and the events of our era in a way that's a little unpredictable, that doesn't simply fall on the typical right-left scale from a perspective that values individual liberty and initiative and the worth of the human person. And that gives us, I think, a perspective on some issues which is not exactly predictable and hopefully independent. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Let me introduce our panelists and guests today. First of all, our founder and president, David Theroux. Welcome, David.
Thank you.
Delighted to have David Theroux. David Theroux got the Independent Institute going, some 34 years ago, and has under his belt, how many hundreds of books have you published over these years, David?
I couldn't even count.
Many dozens.
Yeah.
Many dozens of books which articulate a kind of independent perspective on issues. And then also Dr. Williamson Evers, who is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Welcome, Bill Evers.
Thank you, Graham.
Delighted to have you. And we are especially glad to have Dr. Evers. He was for, some 2 or 3 decades part of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, is a specialist on education policy, among other things. And he brings, again, an independent and pretty fresh perspective on issues. So glad to have you. May I call you Bill, Dr. Evers?
Please.
Okay. Bill and David, we are excited to have this opportunity to talk to our friends. There's a lot of issues going on that are worth our attention. So, for example, this morning, I spent, an hour or so watching the hearing in the U.S. House Committee on big tech issues. It was very revealing. I mean, they had Sundar Pichai there. They had the Tim Cook head of Apple. They had Jeff Bezos of Amazon. And they had Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And boy, were they grilling them. I mean, it was pretty fascinating. There was some talk, especially in the part I was watching, on the issues of privacy, ways in which big tech has been cavalier about the protection of privacy. So, for example, many people are familiar with who Congresswoman Val Demings from Tampa area in Florida is. She's under notable consideration for the vice presidential slot. Well, I'm not sure I agree with her on everything, but she did a pretty nice job of skewering some of the big tech companies. She pointed out how during the years from 2006 to 2016, the Facebook and Google gained incredible market power, but became increasingly less interested in protecting privacy. And of course, there's a lot of ways in which, under the conditions of the COVID pandemic, some of the tools and mechanisms for data collection are being deployed to keep track of Americans more precisely than ever before. So there was a lot being discussed this morning. I thought I would turn first to David Theroux for a few comments. What do you think, David, about some of these privacy and surveillance issues? And then is this connected to the second topic of that hearing this morning, which was the monopoly power of these companies?
Well, I think it's important to look at the government measures that have enabled these companies to be essentially conduits for the surveillance state. Most of these companies have large contracts with the NSA and other agencies. It's no mystery or secret that they're mandated to share information
with the government.
With the government, and they're essentially collecting agencies for the government, and they process it. And but it's very lucrative. I would be very interested in knowing what percentage of the income of these, what George Gilder calls walled gardens, is coming from
wealth gardens. That's a good term for it.
Walled gardens.
Oh, walled gardens. Yeah. Well, they're also wealth gardens.
Right. And so that would be the first question I would have. And this relates to the provision in the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, which also relates to this issue of they're being exempted from liability laws because they're able to operate and avoid the standard responsibilities that a publisher would have to be held to.
You know, it's fascinating watching for as long as I did this morning during that hearing. I did not hear anybody bring up what you just said, David. That is, I mean, especially on the Democratic side, there was a lot of talk about the monopoly power of these companies and how they kill competition and so forth, and have a conflict of interest in that role. I heard concern from the Republican side about ideological bias on these information platforms, and I heard some concern about privacy, but no one talked about the fact that their monopoly positions is bolstered by their relationship to government power.
Right, and part you can look at it like the Defense Department and contracts with different entities that make aircraft and weapon systems and so forth. And those provisions exempt those companies from different types of liability. This one is somewhat unique. It's the only part of the economy really that has this kind of special protection. Ironically enough, the Communications Decency Act was originally opposed by these tech companies, which of course originally were far smaller. But now they view this as really a sacrosanct measure that enables them to operate and to discriminate.
Yeah, because it means that the stuff that they purvey, especially the idea stuff that they purvey, they can do so without responsibility because it's other people's words. But they also retain.
They are saying that they are a platform for other people, and if you want to criticize or go after legally somebody who says something, you should go after that person, right, and not after them.
Right. So if they're taking measures to edit and censor or whatever you want to call it, block, shadow ban, whatever it might be, they're obviously just not a platform. They're actually operating in a way that's contrary. So you can't have it both ways.
Well, the statute allows them to have it both ways.
That's right.
That's the problem with the statute.
Exactly.
Yeah, precisely.
That's exactly the point.
Precisely. I mean, it's kind of their bread and butter because it shields them from liability, but also empowers them to control content.
Right.
At the same time, when they're not responsible for the content, and then behind the scenes, as David said, there's all this money flowing in from government contracts, especially federal contracts.
And these contracts through these different agencies are secret, essentially.
Right.
And so, as I said, it's no secret that the companies have to divulge the information, but it's more than that. It's that they're actually being paid to provide it.
Bill, you were going to comment there.
I don't really have anything to add except that I think we're seeing a kind of convergence of illiberal elements on the left and right wanting to control the content of the internet and these different platform providers. And I think, unhappy as we are with a lot of things that go on, if we let these regulators in there, we're going to look back on this as the great golden age of this. And we'll still, vaguely remember it was full of problems. But I can't really want to see Congressman Waters or Congressman Senator Hawley or somebody like this running the internet.
Right. But my point, Bill, is simply to eliminate this.
I see the subsidy problem, I see the surveillance problem, and I see the contradiction or maybe I see the contradiction in the editing, plus we're just a platform. But I would work on the details of that somehow, but not in a way that puts Senator Hawley in charge.
Well, ThinkSpot, ThinkSpot was started
as an alternative
to Patreon because Jordan Peterson didn't want to be censored.
Right.
What's fascinating about the situation right now is that on one level, I can understand why people are annoyed with Facebook and Google in particular when they officially subscribe to the philosophy of sort of open-ended, diverse discourse and so forth, and then they seem not to operate that way. That's an issue of lack of self-consistency. It's not really an issue of First Amendment because they're not government actors unless they are secretly government actors.
Right. So if you eliminate this section applying to these firms, they should be free to edit as they see fit.
Exactly.
That's perfectly fine.
Them edit.
And that gets to Bill's point. So this eliminates the protection that they have.
And don't let Senator Hawley get in there and start to saying you got to have equal time.
Right. It's not just, Senator Hawley believes it'll be he, and Congresswoman Pelosi believes it will be she.
Right.
And there'll probably be some horrible bureaucratic combination of both.
Right.
Worse than both.
We don't want the return of the fairness doctrine applied to the internet. But at the same time,
which excluded conservatives from the airwaves.
Absolutely.
Did.
That's right.
And conservatives now have their own. Conservatives think they want that same thing all over again. Right. It's crazy.
And so when the fairness doctrine was eliminated, that was a major reason why conservative talk radio arose.
Right. And liberals want to bring back the fairness doctrine to regular broadcast radio.
That's right.
Should we go to another topic, Graham?
Yeah, we should. I'm just thinking that part of what I noticed this morning during that hearing was all these complaints about ideological bias, which really were sliding into and maybe coming from the contemporary ideological ferment that we are hearing about constantly. In the wake of the George Floyd death and the protests and so forth, some of which are perfectly understandable, but they seem to be going way beyond that. Everywhere we turn, we're seeing another display of some kind of woke principle which needs to undo American history. This morning I was coming into the office listening to the news radio station here in San Francisco. I don't know if you heard about this, but there's a statue of the early English explorer, Sir Francis Drake, which is in Marin County overlooking San Francisco Bay. And there's word coming of a big protest against him because apparently there was some potential sort of thin connection between him and the slave trade at some point way, 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 way back then. And so, but the county now is removing the statue in a preemptive manner. And their justification is that unless they remove the statue, there's going to be damage not to the statue but to the people pulling down the statue, and they don't want any people to get hurt by 30 feet of wrought iron falling on people. And so, since the protesters are coming to tear down the statue, the county's tearing it down preemptively because, after all, we can't let anyone be hurt by their misdeeds of tearing down public statues. And of course,
I generally don't like speaking in social Darwinistic terms, but this might be a case for social Darwinism. Having the statue pullers hoist by their own petard, so to speak.
Right. But the preemptive part is what I find especially disturbing. It's kind of like a form of self-censorship.
It's the heckler's veto, right?
It really is. All you have to do is threaten, some kind of violence in the name of woke ideology, and then everyone scurries away and tries to get out of your way. It's kind of a form of extortion.
Well, this political correctness, woke culture, cancel culture has gotten so extreme that things that we normally think of as universal virtues, useful skills that everyone should acquire to succeed in society are being treated as part of toxic whiteness.
That's right.
White culture. Yep. Things like hard work, punctuality, politeness. This Smithsonian Institution has a Afro-American History Museum, and they have an online posting of these as part of white culture. And
hey, let me show it to everybody. I've actually got it here.
There it is. Yeah.
Yeah. This it was off in Newsweek, but it's from the African American History Museum of the Smithsonian. It's all about aspects and assumptions of whiteness and white culture. Can you walk us through some of these details, Bill, David?
Well, I can't see them, but they include the things I mentioned. And so rugged individualism is one. Using the scientific method is another one.
Right.
Protestant work ethic. the thing is, working hard and being on time and being polite to other people, this is the way a society works. This is the way we minimize friction and we allow people to flourish and to, they can do their best. And it's suicidal on the part of any cultural group to announce that they're going to reject these things. Rutgers University, also in the last week or so, as I said, it's come out against grammar. They're not going to correct anybody for grammar in the English classes. And it's part of the same thing. If you don't know standard English and that's the lingua franca of our society, our industrial commercial society, and that's what people need to have if they're going to succeed and be a part of it. And
to be exempted from English grammar is to be exempted from success in North American society.
It's really
David, you had some comments about these specific things, did you not, David?
Well, Bill mentioned a few of them. It's things like private property, the common law.
Can you read them on the screen here? I think you can.
Right, rational thinking, hard work, as Bill mentioned. Self-reliance, the nuclear...
objective, rational, linear thinking.
The nuclear family, avoid conflict, competition, progress. Really what this boils down to is a rebellion against reality. Part of that is to deny the existence of the individual person. And so the person is not held accountable, and the person cannot really function as a person, but only in the group. And so I think what this really reflects is the failure of progressivism and this whole idea of identity politics and so forth. So in other words, the person is meaningless. Only the group counts, and people will not be held accountable unless they are shown not to identify with this sort of collective ethic. I think a lot of this also goes further to the sort of reality that progressivism as an ideology, as sort of a secular religion, is a disaster. It's a disaster in these urban areas. It's a disaster in higher education. But progressives do not want to admit they failed. And so the basic focus that they have is essentially dismiss and cancel anything that contradicts it.
So one of the ways people who are behind, not really succeeding in our society, could better themselves would be education.
Yes.
And yet, so we now have the Biden-Sanders pact on, and includes what they're going to do on education. So one of the things they're going to do is throw out objective testing. So they're in favor of holistic, multiple ways of evaluating whether the kids have learned anything. Another thing that they are doing is they're going to
holistic thing sounds on the surface sort of appealing.
It's a way of avoiding objective. Oh, another thing is so one of the great ways that kids from uneducated, less educated families can succeed are charter schools. And they've had a pretty good record. And if they're not working, they're easily dissolved compared to regular public schools who have an eternal life.
They're very accountable.
So this pact between the Sanders forces and the Biden forces to say that local public schools can have a veto over any renewal of a charter or any proposed new charter school.
What? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so Andy Rotherham, who's a centrist education commentator, said this is like giving McDonald's a say over whether Five Guys can operate in the neighborhood.
It's exactly like that.
So this is, of course, to the detriment of the kids who would benefit a lot by having charter school alternatives.
And it's not it's the list that they have here is really a list of values and traditions that enable people to succeed.
Exactly.
And so
they are a prescription.
It's a prescription for disaster. And so
they're inverting it.
Right.
To make
so
it a
progressives have controlled virtually all major urban areas for decades. The urban
So
areas.
look at
the schools.
UTLA, United Teachers Los Angeles Union. They are put forth demands about when they're going to let the kids come back to school. I mean, the taxpayers are paying these teachers to teach, and so that these kids can learn and have a chance to prosper and flourish in the future society. Well, the UTLA says we can't go back to school unless the district has an immediate moratorium on any new charter schools. We can't go back to school unless full-scale socialized medicine, Medicare for all, a la Bernie Sanders, is implemented. We can't go back to school with the kids unless the federal government bails out fully Los Angeles Unified School District. I mean, what does socialized medicine have to do with getting the kids back into school?
And defunding the police too, isn't that one of their demands?
Yeah, they also want a new California wealth tax.
Right, and they want federal bailouts of state and locality. They want fully funded homeless housing by the government. I mean, all this basically is consistent in that
it's hostage. They're holding these children hostage for
and they're
counterproductive and they're liberal agenda.
Right, and they're essentially denying any of the virtues and traits that are needed for people to break out of and lift themselves out of poverty and racism and so on and so forth. They're essentially providing a prescription to keep people down.
Right.
Yeah, that's what's disturbing about it.
That's right.
As
that's exactly what it
Candace
is.
Owens might say, to keep them on the plantation.
Keep them on the plantation. That's right. And one commentator described the public school system, and you mentioned the LA Teachers Union, as essentially a collective form of mediocrity and failure.
Yeah.
So why are we prescribing that as the way to go? Because
the teachers unions,
some interest groups are pushing for it.
The teachers unions are saying that unless we you meet our demands and you implement policies that will permanently weaken and make our students less able to succeed, we won't come back and teach them.
But you have to keep paying us.
That's right.
But
at the same time.
Us, yeah.
Well, it's not just
so one reaction of parents to all of this is to form parent cooperatives, which are being nicknamed pods. So a pod is like a group of families, maybe 5 families or something like that. They pool their children. They get a college student or some person to come in and help tutor on some specialized subjects. Maybe the parents trade off teaching some of the other subjects. And this is being denounced. Oh, you're subtracting from the regular public schools.
That's right.
Well, excuse me, if I'm a parent, I can't help my children. The schools are not even operating.
Right. So you're basically supposed to.
And so this is viewed as some shameful act for which you should feel terribly guilty wanting to help your children.
Yeah, so
this is a horrible attitude on the part of these pundits and supposed policy intellectuals to be condemning parents for trying to help their children.
Yeah, and it's even further because it's basically saying, stay in your place. We'll let you know when we're ready to give you an opportunity.
Stay subservient.
Right. Stay subservient.
If we adopted the principles on that Smithsonian anti-whiteness poster that I was putting up earlier, it will essentially enfeeble all the students and people who are under the influence of those principles of abandoning hard work, abandoning
It's really an
punctuality.
anti-disadvantaged prescription.
I would call it systemic objective racism.
Yeah, I think it is.
Really
That's right.
Systemic racism.
So progressives have failed in the school, and now they're admitting that they failed because they're embracing everything that keeps these people from being able to succeed.
So they're tearing down statues of people that had major accomplishments in our society, in our culture, in our world. Every once in a while, people do change what they want to have around in the way of statuary. But there's 2 horrible alternatives. So one is they're going to put up ugly art that nobody likes. I mean, we can think of some famous statues, they're not really statues, but artifacts maybe that have been put in squares and so forth in New York that
deliberately
people object.
unhumane.
They wouldn't go outside to eat lunch around them because it was so dreary and antagonistic feeling. Yeah. So they're going to do that. Or here's a really funny case. So I'm speaking to you from Orange County in Southern California, and we have a university here named Chapman. And it was the second university to adopt the University of Chicago principles on free speech on campus and things like that. A very good set of principles. And they have a statue garden there where they have interesting figures from 20th century politics and international intellectual life. And one of the things they have in this statue garden is a piece of the Berlin Wall. So I'm very interested in this because I was actually in Berlin a couple of weeks before this wall went up, and I saw the refugees, and I went on at that time, the subway line ran back and forth between the two parts of the city. Yeah. But you could only use Eastern money on it. And the Eastern people would get on the subway, go to the West, and they would do it. They were there. So anyway, the point is, though, there's a piece of the statue symbolize freedom, okay? So Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, says President Reagan. This statue, this artifact was painted over. It was vandalized. And so I posted a thing on Facebook, and I called it a communist cover-up, because they were painting over this evidence from the communists.
Literally covering.
Right. And a guy I know who's an economic historian named Phil Magnus had an even wittier thing than mine. This is the first time the critical theory mob has taken a monument and tried to restore it to its original condition. That is, they painted over the time from the time of the teardown of the wall, because they agreed with the original use. So,
yeah, usually they're tearing stuff, messing stuff up because
they're
they don't
restoring it because they like the socialist era.
That's right.
Feeling of
right. So
that wall symbolized the way of keeping people inside the rules of the Communist Party, limiting their choices, stopping their speech,
it also
making them dependent.
It also simply reveals the reality of cancel culture itself. It's not.
Exactly.
It's not all tradition because you can't do that. It's impossible. You're canceling those things that don't conform to your narrative. So you can control the thinking and the use of words and what have you, and that is totalitarian.
It's Orwellian. It's right what Orwell is talking about when he talks about the memory hole, the rewriting of history, the specialized language of newspeak.
We have a bunch of people who are following us on ThinkSpot, and just as a reminder to those of you who are participating that way, you can indeed put some questions and comments into the ThinkSpot panel, and I'm watching those. Just got an interesting comment or question from someone who's watching with us right now. Says, to what do you attribute the drive towards socialism? Which of the progressive left's grievances are legitimate and which are you less sympathetic to? On a big picture level, I would first comment about that there are ways in which the socialist advocates try to make hay out of some legitimate concerns. And so, if we had time, maybe we will yet today, I'd love to talk about police reform and some of the union issues that have exacerbated racial impact in policing. And so taking advantage of some legitimate concerns, usually they jump immediately to a vast world historical critique, which then has to undermine every existing institution. The prescription goes a bazillion times beyond the legitimate diagnosis. And the reason for that reach, I think, has to do with what's going on among the socialist advocates is that there is, in fact, a spiritual or even a religious kind of an impulse at work. Earlier today, David, you read to me that interesting quote that you had seen or paraphrased from Andrew Sullivan about this. Can you pull that out of your mind?
Yeah, I have it right here, in fact.
Read
this
it.
Is in reference to what is called identitarian creeds. So in other words, the left is essentially pursuing sort of secular orthodoxies. They jettison the Judeo-Christian tradition and embrace...
As we saw in that Smithsonian
thing. And so they embrace an ideological tribalism. So, Andrew Sullivan says, we're mistaken if we believe that the collapse of Christianity in America has led to a decline in religion. It has merely led to religious impulses being expressed by political cults. Like almost all new cultist impulses, they see no boundary between politics and their religion. And both cults really do minimize the importance of the individual in favor of either the oppressed group or the leader. So, and that fits back what we were talking about, this poster from the African American Museum at the Smithsonian, is that you strip away the reality of the basis for every individual being a sacred object and having inalienable rights. If you strip that away, then you're left with this sort of collective mindset, and you try to identify people in the name of equality or even freedom based on other criteria, and the slope is incredibly slippery.
Yeah, so answer in part to the person who sent this note to us is that there's a kind of, I would call it a sublimated or a diverted religious impulse that's at work here, which really accounts for the kind of comprehensive authoritarian streak. We're dealing with the forms of fundamentalism here, politicized fundamentalism, which are even worse than old-fashioned forms of religious fundamentalism because they're so linked to dependence upon state power.
Right. And if you,
Bill, you
just to take, Graham, you mentioned police reform, and that's intimately tied to the current discontent, supposedly. But the weird thing is, if you think about this chronologically, the first few weeks, people were talking about looking at the rules governing immunity of police to suits and looking at the role of police unions in preventing disciplinary or accountability features in police. And people were talking about body cameras and maybe chokehold and related things. And the chokehold thing has lasted a little bit longer, but it switched over pretty promptly.
Those were discrete concerns.
Right, and they are things that you could have worked on. So they didn't get through Congress. Both sides wanted to have it as an issue for them, so they wouldn't push through anything sensible that was even an improvement. And so into this has marched a bunch of identity politics socialism that has displaced the question of, and defund the police, which is not an idea of somehow rationalizing law enforcement. It's just a recipe for the thugs of this ideology to kind of take over in various localities. So I don't think that's something that the regular man and woman in the street is going to put up with for 1 minute. Now, there are ways to reform the police to make it more efficient. Maybe things should be transferred to private systems. There's a lot of different possibilities to think about how to do this more rationally, but not mob rule, not people being murdered in the streets.
Right. I mean, there are these people who do not persuade me, who like to defend this idea of defunding the police. And I heard them, on talk radio, and I've read some articles. They say, oh, well, defund the police doesn't mean taking the money away from the police.
Well, it means taking the money and putting it into welfare state activities.
It means, right. It does mean taking the money away from the police.
So
it's really to make
that's going to make things worse for the lives of the people in question.
Right, and make the whole system less accountable and the individuals involved, including the politicians and here's another quote I thought you might find of interest that relates to this, is following up what I was saying before, equality is reduced to identity, rights are demanded for some and denied to others, justice becomes a weapon, tolerance becomes intolerant, freedom descends into tyranny. So there's the issue of qualified immunity, and the police unions, as you mentioned, are very directly involved in this problem, but they don't want to talk about it.
And think about another thing. There were 4 policemen involved. One of those policemen was a black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why has that vanished from the picture? The problem, more fundamentally, is police practices and the lack of proper feedback and accountability for police practices and incentives in the lives of police.
Well, the reason why the George Floyd murder affected so many people was because it was a clearly illegitimate, horrible act to an individual by another individual, right?
Very disturbing.
And so,
very disturbing. And that's a legitimate concern.
But it doesn't. So that analysis doesn't fit the progressive narrative that it's group identity that causes it.
Right.
I mean, there's no evidence. There's no evidence that Floyd was racist. It's just that he abused and killed the killer of
regardless
Floyd, of Floyd's background, and
the black guy was standing there and commenting all along, the policeman.
Right. So other blacks are killed in Minneapolis and in Chicago and other places, children, and that doesn't make any difference because it doesn't fit the narrative.
It's fascinating how quickly the focus shifted from the discrete concerns about policing to these so-called systemic concerns. And I think that reflects what we were talking about before. Many people who are in fact animated by a kind of quasi-religious political impulse saw this as their opportunity to go way beyond things that could actually be addressed and would improve the policing in the lives of urban residents.
But I also think that Bill is right, that the average person sees this as dangerous and fearful and crackpot. So I think that the perpetrators of this intolerance and violence are really pushing themselves into a position in which is going to be a significant reaction to it, and the reaction could be.
Let's hope the reaction
is not worse. Exactly.
Horrible.
Right of the reaction.
It's exactly
because we know in Western history we've had instances of terrible turmoil, and the result has been some kind of drastic authoritarianism.
So that's another reason.
At a minimum, this is probably going to lead to Trump's reelection, despite the current polling and so forth. Mm-hmm. But which, we're not taking a stand here. We're an independent, nonpartisan organization. But I think just the practical facts are the public is not going to be happy with seeing streets going up in flames and rock throwing.
It's ironic, though, that
glass breaking.
Well, the point of George Floyd, the outrage about George Floyd's murder, should be applied universally. The reason why people were upset then was because it wasn't being applied. So if then you somehow turn away from the grotesque violence that people are talking about and the cancel culture and all the rest of it, it just tells people that we need to return to first principles. And that's the thing that needs to be emphasized. As you're saying, Bill, Western history and throughout the world history, there have been many examples of horrible things which produced even worse outcomes.
The classic case, obviously, looking back to the end of the 18th century in France, certainly royal absolutism was hardly attractive in France, and there were a lot of truly systemic problems. The solution presented was the precursor of, socialism of the 20th century, and off with their heads and riots in the streets.
They didn't call it the Reign of Terror for no reason.
Right. That's right. And the Reign of Terror finally resolved under Napoleon. And we don't want another Napoleon, thank you very much, whether of the left or of the right. But disorder tends to resolve itself
By the way, in Seattle, they had this little zone called CHOP, right? At one point it was called CHOP. So one of the leaders is joking to the people. And he said, during the French Revolution, if they had an aristocrat up there that they didn't like, what did they do? They put him on the guillotine, and then what did they do? Chop, he says. And they all laugh.
Ha, ha, ha. Right.
That's right. I don't want to make too much of it, but it's kind of interesting that was their sense of humor.
Barricades they put up in Seattle to protect their zone were, very deliberately evoking the barricades of the French Revolution and of the Revolution of 1848. Aux barricades, they said in Paris, and those barricades became, the symbol of, disorder, which ultimately got quashed. What a waste.
We're not against social change, any of the three of us, but it should be for the better.
Be based on the principles we're talking about.
Exactly.
Might be helpful.
Private property, scientific method, all these things that the Smithsonian is against,
Right.
If you had social change that encouraged people to be responsible, make a family, have be responsible, learn things, get to go to school, respect other people's private property, if that were your revolutionary activity, it would be to the better of the country. I mean, it doesn't need to be in any real sense revolutionary, but it just could be a social movement that pushes in that direction.
Those principles are transracial, they're transnational.
Exactly.
And they lead to success.
But ethnic groups that adopt them do better.
That's right. Exactly. Tom Sowell has written many books that explore and document this, and this is not rocket science, but it doesn't fit the narrative. And the saddest part of it is the people who suffer are the people who are in these urban enclaves, who are the subjects, the victims, so to speak, of these policies that keep them down. And that's why it's so striking to see a museum in the name of African American culture basically saying, you stay down and don't try to do anything else.
Remain in a position where you will need the patronage of the state.
I mean, you can't. So they have an exhibit there about Ida B. Wells, who was a famous black journalist who crusaded against lynching at the turn of the previous century. I can't imagine saying to Ida B. Wells, well, what do you think of following science? What do you think of being polite to other people? What do you think of working hard? Right. Is that something you want to teach your children and your nieces or your nephews or your friends? Or is that something that's condemned as some sort of toxic thing? She wouldn't say, are you crazy?
I mean, just looking at the crime rates of Chicago or Philadelphia and many other cities, New York and so on, it's an appalling thing that African Americans have an enormously high crime rate among themselves. Now, every ethnic group, largely in that ethnic group is where most of the crime occurs. Blacks on blacks, Hispanics on Hispanics, and so on. But if you look at the African American crime rate,
whites.
But if you look at the African American crime rate, it's far higher than the other groups, and the African Americans are the most affected by progressive policies. I mean, imagine living.
And they would like police to come in and help them with this problem.
That's right, and also it's. I mean, think of it. You've got government schooling and healthcare and food and housing and recreation and everything, and it's dysfunctional. And
no doubt, the Chicago schools are horrible.
That's right.
And the main people who are suffering are African American.
Right. So you've got 100. The estimate is 100,000 gang members in Chicago, and most of these young men can't read and write because of the schools.
Can't read and write, and they're also blocked from opportunity because of occupational licensing. All sorts of things. Things that just discourage mobility.
Right. So the opportunity is in the gangster world, with the drug war and whatever, and sex trade and so forth, and so
we would like an opportunity society where honest work can flourish, and people who want to apply themselves have a chance to better themselves.
And if you talk to any average black person or any other person, they're going to say, "Of course." So this ideology is really an elite trying to impose a cultural norm.
People who haven't followed that in order to get where they are, saying, I mean, this is so. For example, we're having ethnic studies pushed in California as a compulsory requirement. The main legislators that are pushing for this didn't take this in school themselves, went to elite schools themselves. It didn't make people study this. They took a normal educational course. They worked hard to get where they are. And now they're turning their back on what gave them the platform to succeed and blocking their friends and neighbors from following the path that was successful for them. It's the most peculiar, counterproductive thing, but it's in the name of ideological beliefs and maybe to some extent in their own advantage.
I also want to mention the issue
to keep rivals away.
I also want to mention the issue of fatherless families, which is a gigantic problem in these urban areas. And in the black community, 70% plus children are born out of wedlock to young girls. And then
here they are saying, "Oh, nuclear families, that's a trait that's toxic."
Right, and here's
come on, that's the opposite.
Right, and so here's a quote from Barack Obama in 2008, which was really what we should be hearing.
Was right.
He says, "Children who grow up without a father are 5 times more likely to live in poverty and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of schools, and 20 times more likely to end up in prison." So that's the kind of role model that we need, is to make that point.
Thank you, President
which
Obama.
goes directly against what this museum is saying and what these other entities are trying to exalt.
I just want to point out, we're going to come in for a landing here shortly, but we did talk in passing about the important ways that policing can be reformed. Just to our participants and those who may be viewing this later, the Independent Institute has in fact created a body of work which is very much worth consulting regarding police reform. We have a piece on our website that's coming out in the Independent Review shortly also on officer privileges and unionization by Tate Fegley, one of our research scholars. It's a very interesting piece in which he demonstrates how, in fact, I would say systematically, maybe not systemically, but systematically, the union contracts actually cover and conceal police abuse, make it very difficult for hiring departments to get a clear idea of the violence records of officers they may be trying to pick up from other departments. Create kind of a culture of insulation and lack of accountability, and it's all bound up in these union contracts. It's very much worth looking at the material. You can go to independent.org and find that material on police reform. Also, we've put some things together, and others have as well, on the need to pull back on this qualified immunity principle, which, as David Theroux mentioned a little while ago, prevents individuals from being held accountable for what they do simply because they are employed by, well, police departments or others.
It's not just police, it's many government officials.
Yeah, many government officials, right.
So
all those things really do create patterns of, concealment and lack of accountability that then provide cover for people who are racist or abusive in other ways. All that can be undone. It's not necessary to maintain all that stuff. The unions don't have to be given their full sway in policing, just as the unions don't have to be given their full sway in education, our K-12 system. In both cases, union power stands in the way of the well-being of the people whom it allegedly promotes.
We actually had a president, Calvin Coolidge, who came to public prominence because he stood up to the police.
That's right.
I admire Calvin Coolidge greatly. He was one of our best presidents, least appreciated. Maybe as a kind of a final thought, I'm going to swing back to what I mentioned at the beginning. I was watching the hearing before the House committee regarding big tech this morning. One of the few things that all parties agreed on, it was very heartening, was the fact that I think it was Ken Buck, congressman from Colorado, asked each of the 4 big tech companies if they would promise not to use anything created by slave labor in China. And they all took the public pledge, and in fact, there's a bipartisan legislation for that. It's really important where we can take a stand not to feed into slave labor. That was kind of a good thing. And in general, I think we need to be aware of the fact that Chinese communist totalitarianism actually is a threat not only in China, but also to the degree that people around the world feel they need to subscribe to it. We don't want a comprehensive surveillance society where individual liberty is curtailed. We want one where people can make their own way and take care of one another freely without becoming wards of the state. And with that, I think it's a good place to stop. Final comments from Bill Evers.
No, I've just enjoyed this whole conversation we covered a lot of the things that are right in the news, current right now. And I've enjoyed it, and I think we gave a pretty good analytic focus on it.
More to come. Last words from you, David Theroux.
I'd echo what Bill said, and I think the consistency to all that we've discussed is this idea of first principles, but also the idea of human dignity. And if you deny
liberty,
right, if you deny the dignity of the person, all hell will break loose.
That is for sure. So we invite our friends around the ThinkSpot universe and elsewhere to visit our resources at independent.org online. Also, keep watch for future announcements. We are going to be doing the Independent Outlook live stream again, probably in a couple of weeks or thereabouts. You'll get a notification. We invite you to join us at that time. And in the meanwhile, we thank you for participating with us. Thanks and goodbye from the Independent Institute. Take care.